I love talking through questions from future educators or people who are interested in what's going on in schools generally. So I've got a few fantastic and thoughtful questions here, and let's see what we think about them. How do you manage a class of students who will talk over you or are unwilling to learn or behave? So this is one of those questions where I think it is important to not only provide an answer, but also to think closely about the premise of the question. When I read this question, I think back to when I was in my first couple of years of teaching and maybe my first weeks of teaching, and I think I conceptualized of the classroom as an environment to be controlled, and it's full of people who want to do certain things and I want them to do something else. So how is it that I bring enough consequences, positive and negative, that can kind of incentivize people to do the thing that I want them to do, focus on learning, engage in an activity, do their homework, whatever it was, using rewards and punishments and those kinds of things. And even though there is definitely a place for consequences in a school classroom, or indeed in any environment with other human beings in it, I think over the course of almost 20 years now of being a classroom educator, my view has shifted from the classroom being an environment to be controlled more to an understanding of the fact that every time you walk into a room and you have your students there, there is a relational dynamic there that needs to be navigated and needs to be cultivated in a way that is going to be helpful and constructive and can get everyone in the room headed in the same direction. And there is definitely a place for structure and, as I mentioned, consequences before, because I think when I started out teaching, I wanted to be friends with my students, which was a lot easier to do when I was closer in age to my students. But actually, trying to be kind of that relaxed, laissez-faire teacher who didn't really respond strongly to negative behaviors in the classroom, I learned pretty rapidly that that was not doing anyone any favors. So I'm not saying that you just kind of let people do whatever they want in the classroom, but at the same time, you can't, frankly, control students. Students are human beings with their own will, and whatever kinds of rules you put in place, people will always try and push against them if there isn't a positive dynamic and a reason and a rationale or motivation for wanting to cohere to those rules. So let's now take a step back and think about, that's me questioning or prodding the premise of the question in terms of managing a class of students who are just loud, rowdy, don't want to pay attention, don't want to actually engage in learning. What are the actual things that I do within the classroom? So I can think about 3 things in particular. Number 1, let's talk about rules and consequences. Number 2, we'll talk about relationship. And then number 3, I want to talk about learning and teaching and how that relates to behavior, because we can often think about those as separate things in separate buckets, but I think they're much more intertwined than we often realize. So, because I think it sort of most directly relates to the question, let's talk about rules and consequences. I do think that there is a place for firm expectations and order within a classroom. And that's just so that there is a clear sense for what to expect, what behaviors are okay, and particularly when you are interacting with younger students, but frankly, students of any age, and indeed even adults, being able to set up what the norms are for a space and say, this kind of behavior is right and appropriate, and this kind is not. It's disruptive, it's unhelpful, it is counterproductive to learning. It is the role of the teacher to, with their students, set the agenda on that and be able to, the word that comes into my head is to kind of guide how those rules and expectations are kind of responded to and cohered to within the classroom. So really simple things, right? Like, say for instance, when someone is speaking, we listen to them, right? Now, there are ways to undermine that both for other students and also as a teacher in the classroom. I quite clearly remember there was a lesson that I observed early on in my teaching career, and the teacher was speaking at the front of the classroom in a voice that was, it wasn't soft, but it definitely was not audible to the entire class because several people in the back row were just chatting away over the teacher. And I watched this happen for 20 or 30 minutes continuously, and here was me as a novice teacher sitting at the back of the room thinking, should I do something? This is an experienced classroom educator at the front of the room. They seem to think this is okay. I guess, like, who am I to question that, right? I remember resolving for myself in that lesson and many other situations like it down the line and throughout my career, that wouldn't be me if I could so help it. That I would not just treat it as okay and just kind of ignore it when people talk over other people, whether it's me somewhere in the classroom trying to explain something to others, or whether it's me calling upon a student and saying, hey, that input is really valuable and I don't just want other people talking over that and not giving that respect and listening to it. So what kinds of things can you do, right? Well, of course you can stop the class, you can not continue to chat away about whatever it is that you're teaching, and you can say, all right everyone, I remember learning this technique, it's kind of like a drama technique actually, called the above pause whisper. And that's, it's a vocal technique where you speak loud enough that everyone in the room can hear, then you pause. And then the next thing that you say, often an instruction or a correction, you whisper it. And there's something cognitive and emotional that happens when you're straining to hear something and you think, wait, what just happened? And it grabs everyone's attention in a way that doesn't work 100% of the time, but is a very useful tool to call upon. And you could say, look, this is not appropriate behavior, where we can't proceed with the lesson at this time, and this is your time, right? So maybe we're going to come back at a recess or a lunchtime and we're going to discuss this further. There are obviously better times than others to use that. Having a lesson immediately before recess or lunch is generally a helpful thing, but just sort of calling out upon the class, that's not the only way to do it, right? So for example, one of the things that I learned pretty quickly was that standing at the front of the classroom and never ever leaving the front of the classroom is a way to signal that there are certain zones within the room where you can kind of just do what you want away from the teacher and their attention. So I started to learn to walk around the room, and sometimes I stay at the front of the room, there's something I want to show, but for other times when I'm orchestrating a classroom discussion or when I am seeing what students are doing, I move around, and I sometimes will just wordlessly come and stand nearby to a group of students. And when a student is, carrying on and having their own conversation about something completely irrelevant, even students who are pretty keen to have that conversation rather than listen to what you're, talking about, even they will sort of pause and feel the social awkwardness of you obviously being aware of what they're doing, bringing them into your attention, and then acknowledging, without necessarily even calling out that behavior in a verbal way, okay, this is not all right, and I'm going to have words with you after this. And then later on, I would have a conversation and I would say, look, tell me why you're here in this class, apart from the fact that you are forced to. Is there something that motivates you to want to learn, something that interests you here that I can connect with? Because obviously, this will get onto my other 2 points under this idea of classroom management, there is something here that's disconnecting for you, right? So I need to understand that rather than just seeking to corral it or control it. So, rules, consequences, the other thing that is worth mentioning there is that co-constructing them wherever that is possible is really helpful. Being able to just come in and say, all right, people, we're going to listen to each other because I say so, right? In certain contexts and with certain ages of students, that authoritative approach to things will work, it will function. But a lot of the times, particularly as students get older, it's actually much more sensible to appeal to the fact that they themselves want to learn. They have their own self-interest for being in the classroom and being able to hear what's going on and what's being explained, right? So if you can co-construct what the expectations are, it's like a social contract, as it were. Perhaps, you've experienced these before. It doesn't necessarily have to be written down, but sometimes that helps, and to have it somewhere prominent in the classroom. Depending on your dynamic and relationship with those students, again, I'm getting to the second point, that can be a helpful thing. Using it as a stick to threaten students with is not the way that I encourage that, but being able to say, hey, look, this is what we all agree that actually is going to be useful. No one wants to have a bad time in their classroom, and so sort of using whatever motivations are necessary to reach into what is it that will motivate a student to choose to actually pay attention or to engage with a task. Making them a really valued part and a serious and integral part of coming up with those expectations, I found that to be very valuable. So now let's talk about relationships. Learning is a social process, and it's been said that without relationship there is no true learning, because the acceptance of and the accumulation of facts is one thing, but learning, the kind that we want in schools and in classrooms, is way more than just being able to recall things, especially when you can just use the internet or AI for that kind of thing. So you are orchestrating and facilitating a social relationship every time you step into the classroom, and indeed when you are outside the classroom. We'll get back to that in a second. And so the first thing that's important about classroom behaviors is that often the classroom behaviors that you don't want to have in your classroom, they often emerge when there isn't a clearly understood dynamic between you and the students you're teaching, when there isn't kind of a, all right, you know who I am. Just the sheer power of knowing a person's name. I've been in many classes where I've seen the teacher doesn't know the student's name. And you know this anytime you've actually interacted with someone, particularly if you interact with them on a semi-regular basis, let alone I see you basically every day or every second day in my, 5 days a week existence. When someone doesn't know your name, that communicates something of value or lack thereof, rather. It's like, you are not important enough for me to actually invest in knowing who you are and being able to call you by name. And when a student is either maliciously or unintentionally not paying attention in my class, not engaged, simply being able to say their name and then to pause. That is a really powerful thing. And it's not necessarily a, hey, I'm getting you in trouble type of thing, but it's a, hey, this is something that's happening between us, right? And you know that I'm not here just to make your life difficult. I'm actually here because I'm invested in you as your teacher. I'm here for your good. I'm here to help you learn, right? And so being able to call upon a person's name and then to also see them, this is where the outside the classroom part comes in, to be able to see them not just as a person learning your subject, but actually as a whole human being. The number of times I have had difficulty being able to strike up rapport and relationship with students in the confines of my classroom, but that's been broken through when I'm able to see and interact with that student in another context. That might be the playground, it might be a sporting team, it might be at some music recital thing that the school is running, or public speaking, or whatever it happens to be, right? Often, if a student walks into your room, they've never met you before, but they don't like the subject that you're teaching, whether it's mathematics, English, PDHPE, whatever it is, right? There's a good chance that they'll be predisposed to not like interacting with you because you are the avatar, you are the embodiment of the subject that they don't like, right? So even if they don't know anything about you, they may not want to really engage with you as a person, right? But being able to see those students, and for those students to see you outside of that context, is often the way in which you can demonstrate that you are a whole human being, that you have a sense of humor, that you care about these students in not just because you want them to complete an exercise or answer some questions, but that they as an individual person matter to you. That can be a really helpful way, especially with those students who I suspect are being referenced in this question, with whom it's not quite so easy or natural to form a relationship with. I've often found it really important to be able to reach them through another avenue and be able to prove that actually you have some worth to them as an educator, as a grown person in their life who is working for their good. So the relationship part of things, developing rapport, cannot be overstated. And so there's a reason why knowing students and why they learn comes before knowing content and how to teach it in the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. I will never get sick of saying that. So then I think the third and final thing that I was going to reference under this idea of managing classroom behavior is about teaching and learning, right? One of the reasons why students will talk over you or will be unwilling to learn or behave is because they are bored and they don't enjoy the learning that you are offering to them. And I've certainly been through times in my career and with certain classes where I've just been in kind of a rut of teaching the same boring old way and not really thinking hard about how to provide my students with a novel and creative experience for how to comprehend and work with the concepts that I want to teach them. And so they are bored. And any human being, child or adult, who is bored is going to switch off. They're going to, talk to the person next to them. They're going to do anything else rather than this thing, which is of zero interest to them. So having variety and being able to think closely about what's maybe a different way that I can teach this, or give students a different experience of learning this. Maybe I'm teaching trigonometry, and instead of just drawing diagrams in your book of like situations from a text, maybe you're just going to go outside with clinometers and measuring tapes, and you're going to take actual objects that are in your school and you're going to measure those things, right? Now, that doesn't make it any more necessarily real world applicable. I don't think anyone is going out there thinking, I wonder how tall that tree is. Oh, thank goodness I have my clinometer with me. That's not really the point. The point is to shake up the learning experience and make it something different and engaging and interesting. And you will often find that an engaging learning experience will go a long way to bring along someone who is more interested in their conversation with the person beside them, or doesn't seem to have any interest in the concept that's being taught. If you can make it fun and interesting and have a game or an activity or something where students are working with each other and collaborating rather than just sitting silently looking at a whiteboard or a computer screen, you want to have a breadth of different pedagogical tools and strategies at your disposal. So the learning and teaching side of things is actually a really critical part, I think, of helping students to themselves be motivated to engage in positive learning behaviours in the classroom.